But I think that, one thing that I really try to remember is other women are my allies. I'm going into any situation assuming that, like, maybe they don't see it that way, but like I am allied with other women in my polycule, whether they are or not.
Welcome to Normalizing Non-Monogamy, the podcast where we interview incredible people from all over the world to hear their personal journeys of self-discovery through the lenses of love, sex, and relationships.
Our mission is to show people that they're not alone and to inspire them to embrace their true selves so that together we can open minds and live authentically without shame.
We believe everyone's story is powerful and beautiful, yet it's important to remember that everyone does life a little bit differently and that the views and opinions expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect our own.
Additionally, we aren't doctors. Please consult a medical professional for anything regarding your health that you might learn about on the show. Enjoy!
Welcome to episode 362. We're Finn and Emma, and today we have a wonderful conversation with Eve. You may recognize Eve as the co-author of the book More Than Two. Today, she's here to share her journey exploring non-monogamy and celebrate the publication of the second edition of More Than Two that was just published a few months ago. The second edition was co-authored with Andrea Zanin, who was previously on episode 356 of this podcast. Links to the second edition of More Than Two and all of the other amazing books published by Thornapple Press can be found in the podcast show notes over at our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com, or in your podcast player.
Yes, we are super excited about this conversation with Eve today as she takes us back in time to her first exposures of non-monogamy when she was in high school, all the way up until today where she finds herself as a queer, solo, polyamorous relationship anarchist. And along the way, we make a lot of stops as she figured it out and learned so much over the years. So please enjoy this interview today with Eve. We are going to jump right into it for anyone who is a premium subscriber, and for everybody else, we're going to go through just a few short announcements. First up,
if you're not familiar with the premium subscription, it's a way to skip these announcements up front, but don't worry, we still tell you important upcoming dates in the outro. To sign up for these premium subscription, go to our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com, scroll down on the homepage, and you can sign up for $4 a month.
Yes, and some of those important dates that we have coming up, well, actually just one of those important dates we have coming up is on October 25th. That is our next virtual speed friending event. We have been hosting these for years and years and years under the name Virtual Meet and Greet, but we wanted to rebrand.
We're rebranding them.
Rebranding them, bringing them back. We just brought these back after our little summer hiatus. In September, we had our first one back for the fall. We had almost 50 people join us from all over the world. We have you come and join us. We put you in Zoom breakout rooms. We ask you a question. You talk about that question for a few minutes. Then we scramble the rooms, ask you a new question. And by the end of the night, you've got a whole bunch of new friends and a giant smile on your face. And everybody had a hell of a good time.
To join the virtual speed friending event, go over to our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com. You can sign up on the banner on the homepage or click under events and you can sign up right there. These are open to anyone. You just must be open-minded and respectful. And we would love, love, love to have you come join us.
We sure would. And if you don't want to wait that long to find yourself with some new friends and community, we'd also love to have you check out our virtual community, which you also hear us talk about every week, because it's something that if I love anything as much as Emma, it's probably our virtual community.
Probably.
It is one of my favorite places to hang out with hundreds of friends. We have over 300 people from all over the world who are in there all day, every day, supporting one another, laughing and loving one another as we all figure out how to do this non-monogamy thing, or even just having friends who are open-minded, whether they're non-monogamous or not. So we'd love to have you check it out.
Yes, we would. To check it out, go over again to our website. You're already there because you're signing up for the virtual speed friending event. Just go over to
See you on October 25th, by the way.
Right. But you can just click on the community tab. All of the information is right there. And you can sign up for just $5 a month. While you're over there on our website, go over to the resources tab and check out our favorite way to get tested for STIs and know your sexual health status. It is stdcheck.com. It is the service that Finn and I use. You hear us talking about it all of the time. By using the links on our website, you get $10 off making a 10-panel test, only $129, and you support the podcast Thank you so much.
Yes, we are super grateful to everybody who uses all of the links to all of the things that we've just been talking about for the last few minutes. These are the ways that Emma and I keep this show free for all of you every single week, and we are super grateful for your support because we absolutely love doing this. We love having conversations like this one today with Eve and the one that's coming next week and the week after and the week after. So please check out everything that we've been talking about. Thank you in advance for doing that. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for us, we'd love to have you send us an email or a voicemail. You can find that over on the Contact Us tab.
Or if you want to come on the podcast.
Ooh, you could also come on the podcast. You don't have to be an author.
No.
You can just be you.
Yes.
That's all we want. So please send us an email, send us a voicemail. And with that, we're going to jump into this interview with Eve.
Let's go.
Welcome to the podcast, Eve. We're excited to talk today. I will say, over the course of our show, your book, More Than Two, has been one of the most referenced books. So it's always exciting to have the authors of some of the most popularly referenced materials on our show. So welcome. We're excited to have you here today and to hear a little bit more about your story and more about sort of the inspiration behind More Than Two. So welcome.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah.
We'd love for you to start by introducing yourself.
Sure. As probably mentioned, I'm Eve Rickert. I am joining today from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Lekwungen and Saanich peoples, colonially known as Victoria, Canada. I am the co-author of the book More Than Two, published in 2014, as well as More Than Two second edition, which is going to be coming out on September 2nd of this year, co-authored with Andrea Zanin. I'm also the publisher at Thornapple Press, which is a Canadian publisher of thoughtful books on love, relationships, and sexuality. So we're the publishers of Polysecure, Love's Not Colorblind, those sorts of titles.
And both those, just for anybody who's keeping track, both of those authors have been on the podcast, which is amazing, as have Alyssa Gonzalez was on the show as well. Lots of Thornapple Press books have been represented on the podcast. So excited to have you here. And maybe if we could go back in time a little bit for yourself, where did non-monogamy come into your sort of worldview for the first time?
That's interesting. So I actually trace sort of my first, what I would call non-monogamous experiences back to high school. And, I had friends in high school who were kind of in open relationships, and we didn't talk that much about it, but it was just kind of a thing that was happening. And I was in, I would say, a non-consensually non-monogamous situation for a while in high school. And then something that looked a little bit like what we might call a triad today. And that lasted for, a week before it went splody because, and I think largely because we didn't have any frameworks, or language or a paradigm that would allow that to be something that could work.
Yeah.
And then it was sort of something that fell by the wayside for me for a few years until late in university, when a couple of friends of mine just decided to open their marriage and got connected to the polyamory scene in their city. And so I started, I learned the word polyamory from them. I started learning about the concepts of it from them, and then sort of started, and again, it was sort of, that was something that they were doing, but I also recognized looking back that I didn't have a clear monogamy paradigm in my relationships at the time either. Mm-hmm. I was in a relationship in university and I would flirt with other people, and someone pointed out to me like that might be disrespectful to my partner. And it was like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. It was and then after university, I got monogamously married. And a few years into that relationship, my then husband and I started learning about non-monogamy, different flavors of non-monogamy, and experimenting. We started out considering swinging. That really didn't work for either of us. And then it went from there to a sort of construct of hierarchical polyamory. But then as soon as there were real people involved, and we actually were in relationships, we started to realize, that's not going to work. So that was where we started to move towards a non-hierarchical model of non-monogamy.
Yeah. It sounds like, well, you might not have had the language. In high school, you started exploring with those types of, more fluid relationships. And I'm curious, did you have any role models or any other examples of that type of thing growing up?
I mean, I hate to say this now because she of what's come out about her since, but I was a huge fan of Marianne Zimmer Bradley in middle school and high school, and a lot of her books have non-monogamy in them, various kinds of non-monogamy. And I'm trying to think, I was actually, partly because of her influences in high school, I was a practicing Wiccan for several years. And I think that, that also contributed to some of that. And I think also just, I have to look back at I was in the Rocky Horror Picture Show floor show cast for a couple of years and was, I was a theater kid. And I would just say that I think the norms in some of the communities I was in were just different than maybe mainstream.
Yeah. I just, it's, as you said that, I was like, I don't know if we've had more former theater kids or more former Mormons on our show, but there's definitely some correlation between them. So yeah.
Parallel. Yeah.
I think it also, what I heard too, sort of through high school and into college, was you kind of dabbled in it, but almost it felt more like you, right? Again, you didn't have the words or the framework, but you were sort of just almost doing it intuitively before somebody points it out. And I think that's such an interesting experience to have when you're doing something. You're like, well, this feels good. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and is like, that thing you're doing, be aware of that. And you're like, well, wait a minute. It felt like everybody seemed to be feeling okay with it. And now somebody's telling me I shouldn't do it or I should be aware of it. And so I don't know, that was an interesting thread for me, that it just almost felt, based on what you said, like it was sort of your natural vibe in some way.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, there was an awareness that monogamy was what I was supposed to be doing, but I feel like it was just never an intuitive way to do things with me. I mentioned when I say I was in a sort of non-consensually non-monogamous situation in high school, there was a point at which I asked the person who was sort of the quote unquote hinge actually cheating in that situation. I said, I need you to tell the other person that this is going on. And he did. And I don't remember what happened. I think, he ended up cutting things off with me, which was appropriate for their relationship. But I think in part of me was maybe there's a way that we can do this, but I'm not comfortable. I don't mind that you're with her, but I'm not comfortable that she doesn't know about me. So. Yeah.
Which it sounds like sort of is what you kind of talked about once you and your spouse moved into non-monogamy within your partnership, that there was always this element of, but there's another person, right? It's not there's other people involved, and those people have feelings, they have emotions, and they exist just like I do. And so it sounds like that was part of the deconstruction for you of hierarchy. And maybe I'm guessing partly why swinging maybe didn't work is there can be some dehumanizing elements in those dynamics, at least even if they're unintentional.
Yeah. I think it didn't work for me because I'm demisexual. And so coming into a situation that is, kind of meat market, for, no offense to swingers at all, but kind of a meat market, which is that wasn't my vibe. I needed to have a connection, and swinging has, at least, 20 years ago, I know the community has changed a lot now. Communities have changed a lot, but there used to be such restrictions on, authentic emotional connection, which is actually what I need to connect sexually. So it was just that doesn't work.
Yeah, totally. And I appreciate you saying that. And I wasn't meaning to throw shade at the swinging world either. We spent 10 years navigating it ourselves. And so there were some of those where, like you said, there was, and maybe dehumanizing wasn't the best way to phrase it, but that sort of, you're there for a reason. And maybe people weren't as interested in who I was versus what I looked like, or who Emma was, but what she looked like, and needing a little bit deeper sort of the human element was missing at times for us. So yeah, can relate to that.
Yeah. And I'm curious too, how did those, it sounds like you kind of bounced through different experiences in non-monogamy with your spouse at the time, and how you touched a little bit, but like I'm curious to dive a little bit deeper if you're willing to, of like how those, I don't know, how those days really went, how did you communicate about it? How did you work together?
How did you figure out how the hell to do it?
Yeah. I mean, I read every single book that was available on non-monogamy at the time, which when we started opening up was around 2004. So between like 2004 to 2008. And I remember being part of online communities. Do you remember tribe.net?
I don't. That one
it was like social networking pre MySpace, social media pre MySpace. And so there was a polyamory group there. And then when we moved to Vancouver, BC, we joined some of the non-monogamy discussion groups there. So just kind of the way that I think a lot of other people did. And I will say, like, looking back, a lot of the things that I did feel kind of cringy to me now. Like, I was, when I was absorbed in NRE, I acted, I think, very selfishly with regard to my husband's feelings. And I do feel like, he was extremely kind and patient. And, I was very happy when he found a couple of lovely partners of his own. I feel like there was maybe a year there where things were really great, at least from my perspective. We were stable, our relationships were stable, I was happy. And then a few more years where things were basically good. I spent a couple of years, partnered only to my husband. I was very absorbed in my work for a while. His relationships were going very well. And then eventually those relationships ended. And then I think that for me in my non-monogamy, things got messy for a long time, during the 2010s, and led me to where I am now. So I learned a lot, have a couple relationships from that time that I really cherish, but I can't say that it was great either.
Yeah. So. Well, I really appreciate the vulnerability in that, Eve, because I mean, this is something I will say, I maybe speak for both of us, but we've come through that, right? There's things we look back on over the last 15 years of doing this that we're like, I can't believe I did this. Or I can't believe I did that. And then we're here today still like talking about it, living it, trying to do it better. And I'm curious for you, like, again, at whatever level you're comfortable talking about, maybe some of the things, again, not to focus on like all the negative, but we do learn a lot. And then we have to like keep showing back up and like, okay, it was cringy, but how do I do it better? And I'm curious what some of those things were for you that you learned in that sort of 2010s timeframe that you're like, yeah, there was a lot of learning in there. And those are hard moments, but they're also really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that Andrea and I talked about when we were writing More Than Two Second Edition is how, people talk a lot about newbie mistakes, all the stuff that you do when you're new to it. But like, we don't talk so much about all the trauma that a lot of seasoned poly people have with them. It's like, we have different, I don't know if it's mistakes, but like we have different sets of sort of, I guess, baggage. We have baggage that we bring. And because of, for lots of us, all of the stuff that has gone wrong. I feel like things that have significantly changed for me, I identify as solo now. It is very hard for me to imagine ever having another nesting partner or even an escalator relationship. Not saying it couldn't happen, but it's like, it took me a lot to get to where I am now, and I'm pretty happy with it. And like, I don't feel a need to kind of risk that so I have a much more solo approach to relationships. I used to be huge into kitchen table poly, I had some really, really lovely KTP experiences, particularly early on in non-monogamy, that I really cherish. But I practice a much, much more parallel style of non-monogamy now. I'm much more cautious about, what kinds of relationships I develop with metamors. And when I start to develop those relationships, I'm extremely cautious about triangulation and, what information is shared between partners among partners, because I have experienced a lot of different kinds of pretty toxic triangulation dynamics. Well, which now plays into my very parallel and solo approach to non-monogamy. What else? I'd say I'm definitely much more aware of sort of patriarchal gender dynamics, particularly when you have a cis male hinge with, partners who are either, women or genders that are otherwise marginalized in patriarchy.
Yeah.
Because there are very much patterns that we wrote about this in More Than 2 Second edition. The pattern of hedging, sort of making sure that you always have someone in the background to provide care while never having to show up fully yourself, and a sort of low level of, not quite competition, but making sure everybody knows that, they could be replaced if they don't. If they're Kitty Stryker's written about this too. We cite it in More Than Two. If you need too much or don't have enough sexual capital or whatever it is, and also the triangulation, I think, is far more effective in those sorts of situations, just because of the way that misogyny is sort of so inbuilt into the ways that we relate to one another, even those of us who've done a ton of work to deconstruct it. Mm-hmm. If you're not sort of vigilant about it, it's very easy, for example, to become, if a male hinge is in conflict with another partner, it's very easy to sort of take their side, villainize the other partner. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen in other gendered configurations, but I think there's a very particular way that it shows up in these particular dynamics, for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, without a doubt. And I appreciate you sharing those. And if I'd love to just talk about a couple of them a little bit deeper, again, whatever level we're comfortable going to, because I think on the first one, one of the first things you said is you're more of a solo style now, and don't really ever see yourself getting into an escalator relationship again. And I'm curious for you,
I'm not saying never.
No, I totally.
It's just not something I'm looking for, but who knows, 5-10 years down the road, what might develop. But yeah. I can't imagine it. So, I guess it's true that I can't see it.
For sure. And I will say, what kind of came to me when you were sharing this, and we're ourselves are sort of in the healing stages from our first sort of major polyamory exploration. And I know it's changed a lot for me in terms of what I feel like I can do right now. And maybe it's different in years from now, but where I'm at today is very different. And it also changed a lot of what I used to think should be, all the shoulds that I used to have. A lot of those have changed. And so I saw a lot of myself in that, sort of the pendulum swings hard one way and then it swings the other. And then it takes a little time, I think, for me to settle in the middle. And I'm curious around the escalator, and I don't know, maybe it's a theoretical question, but it's, how do you balance allowing yourself the freedom to go deep in an experience and connect to somebody without it feeling like, oh, now I'm on an escalator? How do you create depth of connection as a demisexual person while avoiding being on an escalator that you don't necessarily want to be on at the moment?
I'll tell you when I figure that out.
Yeah. I appreciate that answer, because it's a thing that I have these conversations often, and I'm just sometimes the line between going deep and having an experience and being on an escalator can look very similar, or they can almost one can mislead the other. And it's really an interesting dance. And I just thought I would pose the question to somebody else who's sort of like voiced it in that way. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm also curious, kind of on that note, you had mentioned parallel relationships, and I'm imagining some people listening may not have are not familiar with that term. I was just curious if you could explain a little bit from a structural standpoint how, like, what does that mean to you?
It essentially means that there is no expectation or sort of built-in relationship norm that metamors will meet or have a relationship. It's not don't ask, don't tell, in the sense that, like, usually everybody knows the other people exist and probably their names, but there isn't sort of this more. There isn't an expectation of that, that they'll meet, that they'll be friends, that they'll have any kind of particular relationship, that you'll do group activities. Those things can happen, and it really depends on the sort of where you sit on that gradient from kitchen table to parallel. And also, there are so many things that factor into that, right? And why people might prefer parallel relationships, because it could just have to do with capacity. I just don't have capacity to build relationships beyond the friends I've got and the partners I have. It might have to do with one or both, one or more people having a really solo style and just feeling like, well, that person doesn't really have a lot to do with me just because they're dating my partner. Like if we're both solo or we're long distance and time is limited already. I think that parallel poly can arise if there's someone involved who just isn't quite comfortable with poly. I wouldn't assume that, though. It could also be, sometimes you have someone like a Hinge who has a great deal of relationship turnover. And it's just a lot of, we mentioned this again in more than two, that even like don't ask, don't tell can be a way to manage that a little bit, to be like, well, if you are sort of serial dating, I don't need to stay on top of everything that you're doing all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll meet someone when I know that they're like an established part of your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
bring them around once it's been 4 weeks or longer. Otherwise, I'm I need to know.
If you would have them meet your kids, then you can have them meet me.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I really appreciate that. And I know this is, I think, one of those places where it can get very shouldy in the non-monogamy world of like, oh, we should, if you were more evolved, you wouldn't struggle meeting your partner's part. You wouldn't struggle meeting your metamors, or, you should be able to do kitchen table poly. And we've talked, one conversation sticks out to me where they were like really trying to make the kitchen table thing work. And they were all sitting around lunch one day and they were just like, what are we doing? None of us are having fun like this. And we don't all get along like this, but it works great if we're not meshing this all together. And so, like, just breaking away from that, this is the way you should do it versus this is what actually feels good to everybody involved, even if it has, when people say don't ask, don't tell, there's so many people who probably cringed when you said that. Just like the thought of it even being a viable option to most people is like, don't even bring that near me. And so it's just, I appreciate the like sort of the diversity and ways that you've not just accepted, but like also experienced it for yourself.
Yeah, I have had situations where people have tried to push me into a kitchen table dynamic, either where there was a particular person who I just really didn't get along with and didn't want to spend time with. And I felt very pressured to do that, which of course does nothing to make me want to spend more time with them, right? Or in situations where, I just didn't have the capacity, or there's just too much going on with me, right? I've had a situation where I was in conflict with the Hinge, and I'm like, I can't extend myself to new metamors while you and I are in conflict. Like that's, I need to get this figured out first. So I think that one of the reasons people are drawn to it is because when it works, it can be really amazing, right? Like it's just, I've had it work and it's so wonderful. It's so wonderful, like to sleep in the middle. It's wonderful when your partners are planning stuff for you and surprises. It's lovely when you can go on trips together. It's lovely when you can problem solve and conflict resolve together. I mean, it's just so great when it works. and I can understand, and I do feel like the times I've been pressured, I felt pressured into that. It's really because people are trying to reach for that really amazing thing, but it's like it's just not available in every situation for every person, and it can make things a lot worse if you're really trying to, engineer that rather than let it grow organically. And I think it's one of those things like compersion. Like it just doesn't, some people, get that it's a wonderful benefit of non-monogamy that some people get and some people just don't. So
yeah. And when you try to force things, that's often when it doesn't go well, rather than just let things be and go in the organic way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, to your point too, right? I think there is that sort of this vision of a utopia, right? We're all sitting around, like you said, planning each other's birthdays and, oh my gosh, how amazing and perfect it is. And yes, but also, like you said, only if it really actually works versus it's to me, it's not very fun to force two people to plan your birthday party as it is to be like, they did this on their own because of all of like, versus like, hey, I read it in a book and this is like a peak polyamorous experience. So let's shoot for it versus like, could we shoot for like being happy and healthy and supporting each other and where we're at in our journeys and in our nervous systems and all of those things. But there's often these like bigger goals. I mean, maybe that is sort of the escalator that sort of gets introduced at times. It's like sometimes
the polyamory escalator,
the poly escalator, right?
To kitchen table poly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I just really appreciate Eve, like that, in our conversation here, it's clear, like you've done a lot of different ways and then you can come back and with that experience, look at it and go, not that's wrong or that's wrong, but this is for me right now. And I think that's a really powerful place to land, right? Like you even corrected me. Like, I'm not saying I couldn't never get on the escalator again, but right now, this is where I'm at and I'm going to live happily where I'm at.
Yeah. I also wanted to just comment on the piece you brought in about the patriarchy and how that impacts relationships. That is something that, I mean, I'm sure we could talk for hours about, but it's just such a, I mean, it affects everyone. And it's often something that isn't talked about as much, but like when you actually unpack it and there's so much there and it stems from so much history, right? Like, and how it actually plays out in the relationships and being able to acknowledge that and then maybe find, I guess, starting there and then figuring out if something's what needs to change. But I think being able to acknowledge that and then talk about it in connection with others is incredibly important. I just really appreciate you bringing that in.
Well, and with that, I think it was one of the things that I did want to talk about because I as a male, right, as a sort of the person who typically sits at the top of the patriarchy, it's an interesting dynamic because it sounds like you right still are interested in partnerships with men and so how do
I sometimes wish I weren't.
So I don't blame you. Don't blame you one bit. But I think that's the interesting dichotomy or the tension there is I'm still interested. I still want to do this. And how do I do that while also being aware of the potentials, but not letting them sort of freeze me? Yeah. And I don't know if there's...
How do you move cautiously?
How have you found...
But still, forward in an authentic way.
Yeah, and what's interesting, in counterpoint to the conversation we just had about parallel poly and KTP, I do think that one of the best ways to disrupt those structures is for the women within a polycule to know and be friends with each other, or at least respect and be able to listen to each other. And I mean, there's also a piece here, which is that if you're doing parallel poly, the hinge needs to have just exceptionally good boundaries so as not to introduce triangulation dynamics. So, don't be processing your conflicts with one partner with another partner, or, complain about your other relationships, or do comparisons, or sort of do anything that might introduce, like, create a picture in someone's mind of who that other person is if they don't have some kind of one-on-one connection. But I think that, one thing that I really try to remember is other women are my allies. I'm going into any situation assuming that like maybe they don't see it that way, but like I am allied with other women in my polycule, whether they are or not. And if I start to think, oh, this person, to entertain these sort of misogynistic tropes of like, oh, they're unstable or they're unreasonable or they're angry or they're mistreating my partner. I'm like, well, let's look at how I might have been trained to see other women that way. And yeah, I think that if that starts to happen, I would say then I do feel like it's important for metamors to meet. Like if you start to feel like if you're in a parallel situation, you start to feel like you're in conflict with someone who you don't really know or haven't met, like that's probably a hinge thing going on. Like it's probably a hinge boundaries issue. And I feel like sitting down with that other person directly and being like, let's talk about what's actually going on for us here, can be a really helpful way to do that. But I think if you're going to do that, you have to go in with like try to set aside whatever you might have learned from your hinge, right? And say like, it goes back to like believing women, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to believe women. I'm going to believe you. At least, treat your story as credible, even if it's maybe different from what I've been hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that leading with like women are my allies. Like just starting there is it's just such a different, it's a framework that you can practice rather than what maybe the world has taught us.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to like step necessarily out of that paradigm, but also I think generally speaking that our metamors are our allies, right? In general, that if we're really developing a negative persona or picture of our partner's partner, that's a place I think is really important to stop and talk about. And we've had some people tell us that before too. They're like, hey, like I'm getting a really negative viewpoint of your partner and I don't want that. Like I want to be able to, like, even if we're not best friends, like I don't want to have just a negative viewpoint of them. Yeah, being able to call that out in the moment. And like you said, I think being able to then go and try to sit down with them if you can. What is your actual perspective versus what is the filter that you're getting it through? There's a lot. These relationships are tricky. I don't know if that ever became apparent to anybody here.
Yeah. I'm also curious, completely changing the subject. I guess, what has your experience over the years been in being out about your relationship structure and sharing that with others? And how has that journey gone for you?
So I made the decision in 2013 that I was going to use my real name on More Than Two. And so I had to sort of come out to everyone I was not yet out to. And there was no putting that cat back in the bag. I think that the process of coming out for me and my husband sort of evolved as we did, before we really had any other real partners. We didn't feel a need to discuss it with a lot of people. Then, when we did have partners, we found that, we want to introduce these people to the other people we care about. We want to recognize these relationships. So we started coming out to the people close to us. And then in 2013, there were a couple of people who I had not yet told. And I had to sit down, before we started publicizing the book, I had to sit down with them and let them know what was going on. And, I think as most people did, got a variety of reactions. Some people were fine. Some people struggled with it and then finally accepted it. I did lose some friends, particularly in the early years. As time went on, and I will say that over the last 11 years, it's such a part of who I am that I rarely get very far in any relationship of any sort without somebody already knowing, And, I was at a job interview. Well, for most of the 2010s, I ran my own business. And so it wasn't an issue with work really. And then most of my subcontractors were working on Thornapple Press books. So, that's the other thing. It's like I've published books on non-monogamy. So it's like so much a part of everything I do.
Yeah.
and then it's just kind of a non-issue, because I think that like nobody who would be bothered by that gets close enough to me to be bothered in my presence by it, which is nice. Honestly, it's nice that it's just like, it's not a thing that I've had to really worry about over the last decade. But I realize that is like a position of great privilege as well. That, I lived in a liberal Western city in Canada, West Coast city in Canada. I had my own business. My husband and I owned a home, with, one of the last people we had to come out to was the people we owned a home with. But they had kind of figured it out already. So, and then so the coming out conversation was a lot of like, so is that person a partner who's been coming, or is that person a partner? Like, no, they're not. Yes, they are. Like, so yeah, I mean, even I had a job interview 6 years ago, and I said straight up at the job interview, because it was the position I was going to hold was a fairly public facing position. And I was like, is this going to be a problem? Like, if you Google me, this is what you find. And they're like, oh, no, it's fine. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing to be able to have that, sort of wisdom to know, and then to be able to like lean into it and to put it right out there. I think that's amazing, because I think that's definitely a piece of this for anybody who comes out is, what is the down, like, even if you're looking at it today and you're like, well, our lives can support it today, but like in 5 years, 10 years, what is that going to look like for you? And are you okay with sort of having to work with that? So.
Yeah. And I do wonder sometimes, I mean, I am again lucky. I live in Canada. We are significantly less likely to turn into a theocracy than the United States is. And so, if I had that looming, I have thought like, oh, well, the world could shift really dramatically in 10 or 20 years, and it could suddenly be not safe to be queer or non-monogamous anymore. And I very much cannot ever take that back. So, I guess I just have to take that risk and deal with those consequences, if there are.
Yeah. Well, I just also see this as the part of the reason I know for us that we do the work we do. And I'm guessing part of the reason you do the work you do is so that in 20 years, the shift that we see is not that direction, but to a direction of more acceptance and understanding that we, not that non-monogamy is the way, but it is a way. And I think that is just partly, I mean, why we were excited to talk to you today. And yeah, maybe that is a place to shift to a little bit more about the second edition of More Than Two. And I'm
also curious if you don't mind sharing, like, what was the original motivation for More Than Two? And then I want to talk about
because my question was going to be, what was the motivation to launch to write the second edition of it?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I had stuff I wanted to say. I started my own little non-monogamy blog in, I think, 2011. And, at that time, that was sort of when I mentioned that my husband and I had started with a hierarchical perspective on non-monogamy and had shifted towards a non-hierarchical perspective, but there weren't a lot of resources about practicing non-monogamy that way at the time. Nope. So a lot of the stuff, a lot of the norms, I was like, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't like this. I don't want to do things this way. This doesn't feel good. But, I was having lots of arguments with people about it and not able to find a lot of, like, I mentioned, I read all of the books that were available then, and they were pretty much all like the one that I remember that didn't expressly promote hierarchy was the book Redefining Our Relationships by Wendy O. Matik. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but that was a really foundational book for me. And so I just started writing stuff on my blog, having conversations with people. And it's like, well, I am going to need to write the book that talks about this stuff. And then, I met my co-author, and he had also been wanting to write a book and had actually written a book proposal and pitched it to some folks and been turned down. And so after we'd been dating, 8 months or so, I was like, how you want to write a book and I want to write a book. Should we write those books together and do one book? And he was really excited about that. So we decided to write it together and, looked at his outline, and decided that we weren't going to use it, scrapped that and started from scratch with a big whiteboard, and all the topics we wanted to write about. And that's how it became like the tome that it was. So that's really where it came out of. And I will, just to address a misconception, the content of that book was not based on the content of any website. There were some essays that I'd written, there were some essays that he'd written, and then actually a couple of essays that one of his former partners had written, and all of those were sort of adapted into small pieces of the book, but really small pieces of the book. The vast majority of the book was original work that we wrote in 2013.
Yeah.
And the second edition, so, after we split up, there was a lengthy process of sort of separating all our interests. And the last thing that happened was that I was able to purchase the full rights to More Than Two and all of the associated social media and everything. I just felt like, first of all, having bought it, I wanted to make it mine. I really wanted it to be like, it had been a very kind of life-defining work for me. And I felt like I wanted a version of it that really felt true to my authentic voice now. I felt like, the original work, I could see, over the years as my own growth happened and I learned more, I could see more and more flaws that were in the original and things that I wanted to fix. So I think originally going back to it, I thought, well, I really just want to kind of fix the mistakes I made, right? And address some of the criticisms that have been made of the book, and also sort of shifted a little bit so that there was less of my co-author's voice in the book and more of my voice. So I actually hired Andrea to work on the book as an editor. And their job initially was, they had sort of a defined scope, like remove my co-author's personal stories and anything that very clearly sounded like him, address some of the, gender neutral, or, there was a lot of sort of cis-normative and heteronormative language in that. So address some of that, look at things like ableism. And then I was going to sort of dive in and do my deeper revision, but I kind of needed it cleaned up for me to even be able to look at it before. And so as they were working on it, and I said, if you start to find that you are contributing to the writing, let's talk about co-authorship. And so for the first couple of months, it was like, no, they were an editor. And then they started saying, I think that maybe there are some places where it makes sense to include my voice. And so over time, the collaboration developed. And at first we, it was Eve with Andrea Zanin. And then as we both worked on it more and more and more, and it was a very iterative, lots and lots of conversations, lots of they would write stuff, I would write stuff, and we'd revise each other's stuff. And then we'd disagree on things and sort of hash those out. So there are places in the book where you can see a lot of well, could be this, but also this, but also this. And some of that is just our different perspectives coming into play. And so that was a really lovely collaboration. And I think that it ended up being just a really, really deep rewrite of the whole text almost. We estimate that probably 90% of the text has been changed, replaced, or rewritten. And, there's still the bones of the original are there. There's still passages that you'll recognize from the original, but it's a very different work, which was not what either of us expected going into it. But I think that I didn't realize how much I'd changed, how much I'd learned, how much the world has changed, how much non-monogamy has changed, how many new voices there are. There's just so much to capture in that. So I think it's kind of cool, honestly, because, I've also realized I'm just 10 years older,
Yeah.
So I'm 10 years of life experience. So this is a book written by a 48-year-old instead of a 38-year-old. And that is important. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. I'm really grateful and excited to read it. And I think what you said there about how you and Andrea worked together and you could sort of be like, well, it could be this or this or this. And I think that's one of the things that I love about non-monogamy in general is if we can get away from the back to the shoulds, right? Getting away from the shoulds into the well, you could do kitchen table poly, or you can also do parallel, or you could do it like this, or you could. And so being able to really open up to the possibilities of what happens when you're really designing a relationship of any kind with with the two people who are in it, rather than like, well, what does this person think we should do? And what do they think we should do? And what's the right way to do it versus like, well, what's actually going to work for us in our partnership? Whether it's a friendship or a familial partnership, like I think for me, I see it working across the whole spectrum of relationships. So,
yeah. I love that story of rewriting and how just the collaboration. And I just picture like the intense conversations and you know, some of the conflict coming up and like, oh no, we got to really think about this. And I'm just curious, like, how long was that process? Because I imagine it was not like just a few months. Like,
it actually, I mean, we did it on a pretty compressed timeline, but I mean, we were, you know, I really wanted the new edition to come out on the 10th anniversary of the first edition. So we had this sort of hard deadline. And I think that Andrea started in November, maybe a little bit in October. The bulk of the work started in November. And then I really started in January. We sent the manuscript to design sometime in May. So it was really only like 4 months, but then we were finalizing like our prefaces and like the jealousy chapter and the resources, like those went in, I think, at second proof. So like we were really down to the wire. You know, luckily I was the publisher, because if we'd been working with an external publisher, we would not have gotten away with some of this stuff. And I had, you know, a wonderful team that really pulled out all the stops to still get the book to print on time. So
wow, yay, that's awesome. And it's really cool that it is. I would have wanted the same thing, that milestone of like the publishers on the 10th anniversary. There's something about that like, it's really cool.
I'm curious about, I mean, there was a piece in that, like sort of the rewrite. And when you said earlier in our conversation that like, you look back at some of the stuff that you've done in non-monogamy and like, it feels a little cringy. And I'm guessing there were things that you wrote or talked about in the book that you went back and you're like, okay, I can see why I wrote that back then, but I would do it definitely different today. And I'm just curious, what's one of the things that you're really excited about in the book that you got to revisit and refresh for 2024? And again, without giving away the whole book, I'm curious, like, what's that piece that you're like, I'm hella excited that this got a fresh coat of paint on it?
Well, I mean, it's really more than a fresh coat of paint. It really got kind of stripped down to the joists and rebuilt from the inside out, but
a full remodel
with a couple of additions, and you know, so the entire part one. So the part that covers, like, it's got the introduction, but it's also got the ethics, and like, you know, there's a chapter about choosing non-monogamy, and then there's a whole section on abuse. Like, I would say probably 75% of that is new, and the rest has been reworked. And I think it's real. I'm pretty proud of it. So we took a totally different approach to ethics, and I think we replaced most of the questions. We probably replaced, again, like 75% of the end chapter end questions in the book. But, you know, there's just a lot of synthesis, and that came from, you know, Andrea and I are both avid readers, them much more than I am, but, you know, so there was a lot of synthesis of like the, you know, all the stuff we've read in the last decade and that has influenced us. The chapter on abuse, I think, is pretty comprehensive, pretty important, covers a lot of ground that isn't covered elsewhere. I can't think of anywhere else that is sort of covering abuse from a non-monogamous perspective and some of the unique dynamics that can occur there. So yeah, I am pretty proud of that part.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm excited for it. I'm excited. I mean, I think that's the beauty about where we're at today is there is so much more coming out, and we can read other works and then take those ideas and expand on them or look at them through a different lens, and that works that, you know, are a decade old get refreshed or remodeled completely. And I think it feels like there's some momentum building here around, again, not trying to stuff this into people's faces as the way, but actually accepting it as a way, and in a way that really does work for people.
Yeah. And I think too, like, as non-monogamy becomes more normalized, there's less and less separation between sort of non-monogamy literature and other literature.
Yep.
Less you see, I think, very slowly, maybe, the bulk of like self-help material doesn't always take a purely mononormative lens. And likewise, there's more acceptance that some books like Polysecure might be beneficial to monogamous folks as well. So there's this sort of blurring. It's just like our relationships are just relationships. And so when you're talking about relationships, let's talk about sort of all relationships, because a lot of the skills and issues come up with everyone. So,
yeah, so true. And I love that application. Like, I think no matter what you choose for your relationship structure, you can benefit from reading these books. Like they're at the fundamental core of it, a lot about human behavior and relating with other people. And there's so much you can take away.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think in some ways, again, not to paint non-monogamy as harder or more evolved, but I think there are ways in monogamy that you can get by without some of the skills. We did it for a long time. We got by. We weren't thriving necessarily, but we got by. And so when you start to introduce some of these other stressors, I think the skills become more important. But I also think if you could take some of these communication skills and just strategies, like you said, from Polysecure or Polywise or, Multiamory's relationship tools, but like all of these things, if you could introduce those into a monogamous relationship, I don't know how it couldn't improve the quality of that partnership. So I love what you said there. They're like so many of these skills and tools they're about connecting in general and about building relationships in general. And we're just applying them in one sort of way.
Yeah. Thank you, Eve, for everything you've shared today. We've really loved talking with you. And I just wanted to give you a chance, I guess. Is there anything else that you would like to share and get out there today?
I just want to mention that, I know they're on another episode of this podcast, but I wanted to plug Andrea's other book, Post Non-Monogamy and Beyond, as well as the series that's a part of, which is called More Than Two Essentials. So I'm publishing a series of small books on focused topics related to non-monogamy by Canadian authors. So you can check those out. And they're all listed at morethan2.ca. And that's morethan2.ca. And if you are a Canadian and you're listening to this and you have an idea for a book, please pitch me. Press at thornapplepress.ca.
Amazing.
And links for all of that will be in the show notes too.
They will indeed. And and just another plug for so many of the authors from the More Than Two Essentials Guide have been on the show, and just always fantastic conversations. And so we're excited again to have you on, Eve, and to hear your story and to get More Than Two edition 2 out there in the world. So I'm excited.
Yay.
Yeah.
So thank you again for coming on today, for sharing everything with us, and of course, for the work you do.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And we're back. Thank you so much to Eve for coming on and sharing everything today. We're super excited to get your story out there and for the second edition of More Than Two. A reminder, links to the book and all of the other amazing books at Thornapple Press can be found in the podcast show notes.
Yes, thank you, Eve, for coming on, for sharing your story, and of course, for all of the work you do helping bring and tons of authors, incredible ideas and visions to life with Thornapple and all of your work there. So thank you. Next week no, we're a little ahead of ourselves. We got to talk about October 25th before we talk about next week.
A quick reminder to sign up for our upcoming virtual speed friending event coming up October 25th. It's a Friday night. Come hang out with us, spend time with lots of amazing people from around the world. Sign up on our website, normalizingnonmonogamy.com.
Yeah, I would just say this. It's a Friday night, which is like historically date night. It's a great event to bring a date to.
It is.
We've had people come on dates on our virtual meet and greet. So you could be one of those people. And we'd love to have you join us next Friday.
Yes, please come join us. And in the meantime, you can listen to next week's episode. It will be with Dave. We are super excited to bring this one to you as well. So that'll be out next Wednesday.
Yeah. Anybody who was at our in-person retreat here in the Bay Area a couple weeks ago.
Yes.
They know Dave.
They do.
They know Dave because Dave ran a workshop called Social Massage.
Yes, he did.
So just wanted to throw that out there as a future plug for upcoming in-person events, which are coming up in the spring.
You can find out more over on the community tab of our website.
Ooh, that's a great idea, Emma. Our community sounds like a great place to hang out. All right, this got really weird over here, so we're going to let you go, and we'll see you all next week in our interview with Dave. Until then, have a fantastic week and weekend, and we'll see you then.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.